Russia's central bank has suggested the country's GDP could fall by 8% this year, but other international bodies have predicted it could be as high as 11%.
In the meantime, Russia's inflation rate hit its highest level in 16 years last month due to the weakening ruble.
It's battling a labor shortage that could hamper its economic growth in the coming years.
This Russian economist better watch his back, and definitely stay away from windows, because he just publicly exposed how terrible the Russian economy really is, something Vladimir Putin desperately wants hidden. Academician Abel Aganbegin, a respected 90-year-old economist who once advised Gorbachev, yes, the last leader of the Soviet Union, just risked his life by revealing how badly Russia's economy has performed since the USSR collapsed. In the 34 long years, the Russian economy has grown just 37% total. That's barely 1% a year. For context, China's economy grew by an incredible 13 times in the same period, and India's expanded almost 9 times. No wonder Aganbegin's lecture quickly went viral. And now Russians are finally seeing the reality behind Putin's smoke and mirrors. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Aganbegin also laid bare Russia's depressing lack of startups, innovation, and entrepreneurship. As of early 2025, there are over 1,600 unicorn companies worldwide. A unicorn is basically a startup that's valued at over $1 billion. Russia, unbelievably, has basically none. Okay, technically Russia has 2, but think about it like this. This is the same country that keeps boasting it can take on NATO or even the United States, yet economically, it can barely match tiny places like Estonia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, or even Bermuda, each of which has managed to produce several unicorn startups. The US alone has 700 of them, and China has somewhere between 350 and 400. Russia having 2 is honestly just embarrassing. And if you thought that was bad, it actually gets even worse when you look at innovation. Of the 2,500 largest innovative companies globally, companies that each spend over 35 million euro a year on research and development, only 3 are Russian. Just 3. Maybe the rest just spent all their research budgets on bribes to Putin. I wouldn't be surprised. Most Russian factories today still run on rusty Soviet-era machines that belong in museums, not production lines. These machines have outlasted their lifespan by decades, and Russia now has one of the longest depreciation periods on equipment anywhere in the world. So it's no wonder labor productivity in Russia is just a quarter of what it is in developed countries, meaning a worker in Germany, the US, or even South Korea gets 4 times more done in the same amount of time. This outdated industrial infrastructure also means Russia burns through 2 or 3 times more raw materials and energy just to make the same goods as advanced economies. Even if Russia stopped waging wars today, it would take decades to catch up with actual economic powers. And like I said earlier, over the last 34 years, Russia's economy expanded by a pathetic 37% total. China's economy grew 1,300% since 1990, while India's economy grew by 860%. Even the US, an already wealthy and mature economy, managed to double its GDP in the same period. Former Soviet states and Eastern European countries typically grew by around 250%, making Russia's performance look embarrassingly stagnant by comparison. Yet, talk to any pro-Putin loyalist, and they'll proudly tell you how Putin transformed a chaotic, struggling economy of the 90s into an efficient, centralized powerhouse. But the truth is, by nearly every measurable standard, the average Russian today is worse off compared to the rest of the world than they were decades ago. Even life expectancy has regressed to about 70 years, the same as it was back in 1964. An average Russian today won't live any longer than their grandparents did in the Soviet Union 60 years ago. And remember, all of this economic disaster has happened while Putin's been Russia's top guy for over 2.5 decades now. Yet, all he ever seems to do is either blame the West or start another war to hold on to power. Putin even had to step down from the presidency for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012. Not because he wanted to, but because back then, Russian law limits presidents to just 2 consecutive terms. During those years, Putin stayed close by, serving as prime minister, while his hand-picked friend, Dmitry Medvedev, held the presidency. And conveniently, during Medvedev's brief presidency, they changed the rules, extending presidential terms from 4 years to 6. So when Putin returned to office in 2012, he got a fresh start, with brand new term limits, effectively resetting the clock. But even that wasn't enough. So in 2020, Putin went even further and managed to push through a constitutional amendment that basically wiped his slate clean. All those years he'd spent in power suddenly didn't count anymore. Thanks to this political reset button, Putin can now legally stay president all the way up until 2036. Unless, of course, someone somehow manages to remove him sooner. Even if you forget the past and only consider the period from 2013 to 2022, this is before the war, by the way. The average Russian was still earning 7 to 8% less in real terms than in 2013. Imagine working for 10 years and ending up poorer in the end. Sure, income saw a slight bump between 2022 and 2023, but that wasn't because of the economy getting healthier. It was a temporary illusion created by wartime labor shortages and massive military spending. By the end of 2024, even that artificial boost was gone, and salaries settled right back to their 2013 levels, around $800 per month in purchasing power. Imagine wasting an entire decade in the 21st century. An entire decade with no real innovation, no industrial transformation, no leap forward in AI or technology, and certainly no improvement in quality of life or the standards of living. And yet, despite the stagnation, Putin felt confident enough to plunge his country into a devastating full-scale war. And it's not as if Russians were completely unaware that things were getting worse. Russian economists had been quietly warning about the stagnation for years. But those who dared to speak too openly either vanished or conveniently ended up falling out of 6th-floor windows after shooting themselves multiple times. Just ask Sergei Guriev, a respected economist who had the courage, or maybe the foolishness, to openly criticize Kremlin policies. Back in 2013, after finding himself suddenly under investigation for questionable charges, Guriev quickly realized he was next on Putin's hit list. He chose freedom over fear, packing up and fleeing to Paris rather than waiting for a late-night knock on his door. And what exactly was his crime? Co-authoring an honest report criticizing the sham prosecution of oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky, basically telling the truth about Kremlin corruption and abuses of power. And then there's Andrei Ilianov, Putin's own former chief economic advisor. In 2005, Ilianov resigned in disgust over Putin's increasingly authoritarian anti-market policies. Years later, he openly described Putin's decisions as a complete disaster. And what happened next? Well, in 2023, Moscow officially slapped him with the dreaded foreign agent label, a modern-day scarlet letter used by Moscow to publicly mark critics for harassment, surveillance, or worse. Realizing Russia was no longer safe for anyone who spoke inconvenient truths, Ilianov packed up and left years ago. Even Putin's closest allies weren't safe to openly speak their minds. In June of 2023, Andrei Makarov, a senior member of Putin's own party and chairman of the parliament's budget committee, momentarily lost his cool during Russia's biggest economic forum. He publicly admitted that Russia had no honest courts, no investment climate, and no functioning institutions. He even criticized the government's habit of seizing private companies. Then, half joking but clearly nervous, he said he hoped he'd still be alive to attend next year's forum. This man is literally the chairman of the parliament's budget committee, one of the most powerful positions in Russia, and even he felt compelled to publicly reassure himself that he wouldn't end up jailed, dead, or labeled a foreign agent just for speaking the truth. Thankfully for him, he's gotten away with it so far. But the same can't be said for Russia's foreign minister of economic development. In 2016, Ulyakayev objected to a shady deal involving Rosneft, a state-owned oil giant led by Putin's close friend, Igor Sechin. Ulyakayev argued that Rosneft shouldn't swallow up another oil company in a blatantly rigged privatization, a direct criticism of Putin's inner circle. Not long after, he found himself in handcuffs, arrested in a made-up sting operation where he was accused of demanding a $2 million bribe. Nobody in Russia believed it was actually about bribery. It was a clear signal to everyone else. Criticize Putin or his inner circle, and your career and possibly your life are over. Ulyakayev's arrest was also the first time in decades that a sitting Russian minister had been jailed. Now, we could keep going because the list of Putin's targets is tragically long, but now you get the idea. In today's Russia, even acknowledging Putin's failures can ruin your career. Going public with the truth is literal suicide. As for Agenbegin, well, considering the pattern, it might only be a matter of time before Putin decides his honesty has gone too far. But it's not just Putin. Over the next 40 minutes or so, you'll be surprised to see how a handful of leaders controlled the fate of the Soviet Union, and later Russia, for more than half a century, gradually rotting it from within. I mean, how did a USSR superpower with a space program and the world's most lethal nuclear arsenal end up in such a sorry state that a 92-year-old had to strip Putin down? The answers might genuinely surprise you. And hey, speaking of surprises, you can surprise us too by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Okay, let's jump straight into it. After World War II, the Soviet Union bet everything on massive industrial growth and rigid central planning. And to be fair, at first it worked spectacularly well. By launching Sputnik into orbit in 1957 and putting Yuri Gagarin in space in 1961, the Soviets proved their science and industry could go toe-to-toe with any global power. They churned out tons of steel, cement, coal, machinery. Heavy industry was booming, and employment was guaranteed. But their biggest mistake was assuming this prosperity would last forever. So instead of diversifying or planning for the future, leaders like Leonid Brezhnev, who ruled the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982, stubbornly refused to modernize or focus on consumer goods and basic quality of life. Sure, factories hit their quotas, but they mostly produced things nobody actually needed or wanted, paving the way for widespread corruption. Mountains of steel and cement rolled endlessly off of production lines, usually inefficiently, wastefully, and sometimes just to tick boxes on a bureaucrat's checklist. So the economy quickly ran out of steam. By the late 1970s, growth had basically flatlined, turning into an era the historians now call the Brezhnev stagnation. In fact, the problems that plagued the Soviet economy look eerily similar to China's current struggles. Both the Soviet Union, then, and the Chinese Communist Party, now, rely heavily on centrally planned targets, which inevitably create massive loopholes and corruption. In China's case, local officials manipulated GDP targets by lending easy money and land to property developers, creating a false boom that later collapsed into the ongoing real estate crisis. Back in Moscow, managers resorted to equally absurd methods. For example, if a nail factory had its production quotas measured by weight, they would simply make giant heavy nails nobody could actually use. If the quota was based on the number of nails, factories produced thousands of tiny, useless nails instead. Either way, the quotas looked good on paper but were meaningless in real life. Quality plummeted, waste skyrocketed, and innovation completely disappeared. By the early 1980s, the Soviet economy started going backwards, with industrial output plunging nearly 40%. If it hadn't been for oil, the Soviet Union might have collapsed even sooner. Oil was the lifeline of the Soviet economy. In the 1970s, when global oil prices soared, billions of dollars flowed into Soviet coffers. The petrodollars allowed Moscow to import grain, advanced technology, and even basic consumer products, things their own factories simply couldn't produce efficiently. But that lifeline suddenly vanished when global oil prices crashed in the mid-1980s. Soviet crude oil prices collapsed from about $28 per barrel to under $20 by 1986, and stayed painfully low for years. Almost overnight, the USSR lost its main source of reliable cash. With revenues plummeting, the Soviet government was forced to burn through its dwindling reserves just to keep importing enough grain and basic goods for its citizens. This devastating oil price crash was one of the key dominoes that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. By 1985, life in the USSR was embarrassing compared to the West. Living standards were shockingly low, and the average Soviet citizen enjoyed a per capita GDP of just about 36% of what their American counterparts had. With their reserves quickly drained, the Soviet Union had no choice but to rely on domestic production. But those goods were often scarce, unreliable, or just plain shoddy. With few options left, ordinary people lined up for hours to get their hands on some meat or food. What's truly shocking is that the USSR had once been the world's largest grain producer. But thanks to disastrous agricultural policies, by the 1980s, it couldn't even feed its own people without importing massive amounts of grain. Millions of tons of wheat had to be purchased from capitalist countries, often their biggest rival, the United States. People began to realize just how deeply rotten the system had become. But just like in Putin's Russia today, openly admitting it was a form of political suicide. So everyone pretended things were fine, stumbling along through the late 1970s and the early 1980s, hoping minor adjustments would magically fix a fundamentally broken system. Spoiler alert, they didn't. By the time the elderly Brezhnev died in 1982, followed by two short-lived successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, who basically lasted a couple of years each, the Soviet economy was already in critical condition. And yet, despite being on life support, the USSR continued pouring an astonishing 15 to 17% of its GDP into military spending to keep pace in the Cold War arms race. Some estimates from the late 1980s even suggest the number was much higher. In 1987, when Gorbachev finally published the real numbers, It turned out an unbelievable 40% of the entire Soviet budget was going straight into defense. Just let that sink in. Nearly half of the nation's money was going to missiles and tanks, while ordinary citizens stood in lines for bread imported from the enemy. If that doesn't show you just how broken Soviet priorities were, I don't know what will. Clearly, something had to change. The Soviet Union simply couldn't go on like this without either radical reforms or total collapse. It was in this critical moment, in March of 1985, that a relatively younger and energetic leader named Mikhail Gorbachev stepped into the scene. At just 54 years young, nearly 2 decades younger than the elderly leaders before him, he represented a fresh face and a rare glimmer of hope for a country desperately needing new direction. Soviet citizens, exhausted by decades of stagnation, hoped things might finally change for the better. Little did they know that that change was coming, but not in the way that anyone had expected. Initially, Gorbachev's favorite word was uskarenya, meaning acceleration. He believed that with better discipline, tighter management, and some limited openness, the existing Soviet system could bounce back. He simply wanted to improve efficiency, tackle corruption, and make central planning work better. Interestingly, one of his first major moves had nothing to do with factories or quotas. It was a massive campaign against alcoholism. At the time, the USSR had a serious drinking problem. The average Soviet citizen was consuming around 15 liters of pure alcohol each year, nearly double what you'd seen in countries like Canada or the United States. Public health was suffering terribly, and life expectancy was actually dropping in the early 1980s, partially because of widespread alcohol abuse. Nearly half of all hospital admissions were alcohol-related issues. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Soviet factories were already plagued by inefficiency, but drunkenness just made things even worse. Workers often showed up drunk or drank on the job, leading to frequent accidents and even lower productivity. So, in May of 1985, Gorbachev launched a sweeping anti-alcohol campaign. Vodka, wine, and beer prices shot up. Alcohol sales were restricted to specific hours. Thousands of liquor stores closed, and the legal drinking age rose from 18 to 21. At first, the campaign looked promising. Official alcohol sales dropped significantly, and overall alcohol consumption reportedly fell by around 50% within 2 years. But there was one huge unintended problem that nobody anticipated. By drastically cutting alcohol sales, Gorbachev accidentally blew an enormous hole in the Soviet state budget. Why? Well, vodka is Russia's unofficial national drink. They claim it's tea, but even a kid knows it's vodka. And back then, vodka was literally one of the biggest sources of revenue for the Soviets. For decades, the USSR had practically held a monopoly on alcohol sales. And by the early 1980s, alcohol taxes alone accounted for roughly 12 to 13% of the total state budget. By one estimate, in 1979, the Soviet government earned 25.4 billion rubles from alcohol taxes out of a total 65 billion rubles in tax revenue. Vodka sales brought in so much money that government officials jokingly called alcohol the Soviet Union's vodka oil well. So when Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign suddenly slashed alcohol sales, it also meant cutting off one of the government's most reliable income streams. Gorbachev's intentions might have been good, but he underestimated just how deeply vodka was woven into Soviet life. Turns out, the alcohol sales did drop, but people never stopped drinking. Instead, they simply switched to homemade moonshine and black market liquor. As a result, official alcohol revenues collapsed. In 1986 alone, the first full year of his anti-alcohol campaign, state revenues from alcohol dropped by roughly 1/4. Now, that might not sound huge, but it meant the Soviet budget suddenly lost around 3.5% of its total income. Almost 60% of what the country spent on its entire healthcare system. For a country already burdened by enormous military expenditures and economic stagnation, this loss was devastating. Turns out the Soviet finance ministry had warned Gorbachev about exactly this outcome, but he overruled them, convinced the social benefits would outweigh any short-term losses. And as it turned out, they didn't. To cover this sudden shortfall, the Soviet government did what most governments do when they are backed into a corner. They started printing more money. Cutting other spending wasn't really an option. The defense budget was sacred, protected by powerful political interests, and reducing consumer subsidies would have sparked public outrage. Printing rubles seemed like the easiest choice, but it came with a massive downside: inflation. Normally, when you print too much money, prices quickly rise. But in the Soviet economy, prices were tightly controlled and fixed by the government. So, instead of higher prices, there were suddenly empty shelves. Goods vanished from stores almost instantly, as more rubles chased fewer available items. Economists called this repressed inflation, a hidden form of inflation that shows itself through empty store shelves, long lines, and savings piling up with nothing to buy. Without realizing it, Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign made the USSR's financial situation even worse. Seeing this disaster, Gorbachev quickly pivoted, looking for other ways to revitalize the economy. He pushed for more investment in technology and modern machinery, hoping to drag outdated Soviet factories into the modern era. He also began to talk about the human factor, the idea that Soviet citizens needed motivation and incentives to work harder and care about the results. But motivating people wasn't easy in a system that offered workers basically no meaningful rewards. After all, there was a common saying at the time: the Soviet Union pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work. Factories couldn't reward good work with higher pay. Workers were guaranteed their jobs regardless of how productive or lazy they were. And wages had virtually no connection to effort or quality. Gorbachev understood that without changing this mindset, his Oskarenia plan for accelerating growth wouldn't stand a chance. To encourage change, Gorbachev introduced another idea called glasnost, meaning openness or transparency. He believed that openly discussing problems in the media would help society acknowledge issues and rally support for reform. What he didn't anticipate was that glasnost would quickly spiral out of control. People suddenly saw how truly broken the system was, fueling anger and public frustration rather than unity. By 1986, when none of Gorbachev's early reforms worked, he introduced a new and more radical idea, perestroika, meaning restructuring. Initially, Gorbachev thought perestroika would fix socialism, not end it. His goal was to make the planned economy more efficient by introducing some capitalist-inspired practices, like allowing state enterprises more freedom and making managers accountable for their own results. A year later, in 1987, new laws allowed state factories to plan their own production based on real consumer demand, rather than a strict state quota. These enterprises were allowed to keep more of their profits and had to pay real costs for their materials, which in theory would encourage efficiency and responsiveness to market needs. But this led to new problems. Factories were allowed to set their own prices for extra products produced beyond state quotas. Managers quickly learned to exploit this. They would meet their required quota at the low state-fixed prices, then produce additional goods at much higher market-driven prices. For example, if the state required them to produce 1,000 units at a fixed low price, they'd meet that quota, then produce an extra 100 units and sell those at much higher prices. Predictably, this caused prices to rise dramatically. But production itself didn't grow nearly enough, so store shelves still remained empty. The result was the worst of both worlds for ordinary people: higher prices combined with ongoing shortages. The messed up part is, unlike capitalist countries, Soviet enterprises didn't really have competitors. They were essentially monopolies in their sectors, and without genuine competition, managers had no reason to lower prices or improve quality. As a result, inflation, which had previously been hidden because of state-controlled pricing, now started to poke through. So all it needed was some sort of competition, right? Well, that's what Gorbachev thought. So in 1988, he passed a new law of cooperatives. For the first time since the 1920s, the government officially allowed people to run small, private businesses. This included shops, restaurants, crafts, small factories, and even trading with foreigners. It was a big deal because it gave regular people a way to earn money independently in a country that had banned that kind of thing for decades. And initially, the plan worked out pretty well. Cafes and shops started popping up all over the country, offering better goods, more variety, and quicker service compared to the grim state-run stores. Entrepreneurial energy surged, and a little spark of capitalism took hold. It was supposed to solve two problems at once: filling the gaps left by inefficient state factories and shrinking the widespread black market by giving unofficial businesses a legal path. But soon, trouble followed. Many cooperatives quickly realized that there was an easy way to make serious money without much effort: arbitrage. They'd simply buy state-subsidized goods at extremely low official prices, sometimes bribing factory managers or using connections to access scarce products. Then they'd resell those same goods at huge markups on the open market. People still bought them, often out of desperation, but the result was devastating. State-run stores emptied out faster than ever, making shortages worse, not better. As prices climbed and shelves emptied, people started to panic buy and hoard supplies whenever they became available. If you saw sugar or cooking oil on a store shelf, you'd buy as much as possible. Who knew when you'd see it again? Hoarding became completely rational in an inflationary environment. Families filled cupboards and pantries with staples, and shelves were bare again almost immediately after being stocked. This spiraled into even more inflation, because more and more goods were now being sold at rapidly rising market prices rather than the fixed, controlled rates. Official Soviet statistics in 1990 claimed inflation was around 5 to 6%, but anyone who actually lived through those times knew it was far higher, probably several dozen percent in real terms. It was hard to measure exactly because the Soviet economy was still partially state-controlled. The worst part was that ordinary people quickly began to resent these new cooperative owners. After years spent struggling under poverty and watching inequalities grow, suddenly they saw these new Russians cruising around in fancy cars, flaunting their new wealth, and living extravagantly without seeming to do any real labor. To the average Soviet citizen, these entrepreneurs looked like profiteers, almost criminals, who were openly exploiting the chaos. And there was some truth to that. A lot of black market operators simply used cooperatives as a cover to legitimize their shady dealings and launder money in broad daylight. But instead of seriously addressing these deep-rooted internal problems, corruption, inefficiency, shortages, and inequality, Gorbachev thought the Soviet Union was ready to dive headfirst into the global economy and integrate with Western capitalism. So, for the first time ever, he began encouraging joint ventures between Soviet enterprises and Western companies, hoping it would attract much-needed foreign investment, advanced technology, and management expertise. One famous case of this new openness was the opening of the first McDonald's in Moscow in 1990, a massive event at the time. Soviets lined up for hours, even days, just for a chance to try a Big Mac. For Soviet citizens who'd spent their entire lives waiting in lines just to get bread or basic necessities, lining up for a Western burger somehow felt both ironic and exhilarating. The Soviet government also sought loans from the West to prop up its economy. Western banks were more than happy to lend, initially encouraged by the reforms and promises of market liberalization. By the late 1980s, the USSR had borrowed billions of dollars from abroad, which would later create a debt problem. But these loans came with strings attached. Interest rates, international credit ratings, and repayment schedules quickly became major issues. What Gorbachev probably didn't fully grasp was that integrating into the global economy wasn't just about opening new restaurants or importing shiny new consumer goods. It meant playing by the rules of a complex financial system dominated by Western banks and financial institutions. And the Soviet economy, weakened by decades of stagnation and mismanagement, simply wasn't ready. So, yeah, Gorbachev messed up big time, and the Soviet citizens didn't exactly help matters either. The reforms he introduced could have actually worked if they'd been implemented properly. Instead, rampant corruption and mismanagement turned everything into a mess. Rather than creating a healthy, competitive market economy, the USSR ended up with a chaotic hybrid, half-planned, half-market, and fully broken. The old system of strict central planning collapsed, but nothing stable replaced it. By the late 1980s, nobody was truly in charge, and the economy was spiraling out of control. Things got so bad that by 1988 and 1989, rationing returned to parts of the Soviet Union for the first time since the harsh post-war era of the 1940s and 1950s. In some cities, people had to use coupons for basics like sugar, soap, vodka, and even tobacco. In 1990, Moscow City Council started rationing cigarettes. Each adult got coupons for 15 packs of cigarettes a month because the tobacco shortage was causing unrest and even riots in some places. Now, believe it or not, even children and non-smokers received cigarette coupons, probably figuring that people would barter or trade them. For many Soviet citizens, this felt utterly surreal. I mean, just imagine the capital of a supposed global superpower reduced to handing out cigarette coupons to kids just to keep the peace. Now, during this time, even the industrial working class, the very heart of the Soviet system, had finally had enough. In July of 1989, over 400,000 coal miners across places like Donetsk and Siberia went on strike, something previously unthinkable in Soviet history. They demanded better wages, safer working conditions, improved living standards, and shockingly, even political change. These miners were fed up with chronic shortages, rising prices, and the fact that despite their back-breaking, dangerous jobs, their families still couldn't buy decent food or clothing. What made the strike even more significant was that it was entirely legal, thanks to new labor laws under Gorbachev's perestroika reforms. By 1990 and 1991, some miners were openly calling for Gorbachev's resignation and the end of communist rule altogether. This was devastating for the party. When the very workers you claim to represent are marching against you, your whole socialist narrative collapses. You see, when Gorbachev introduced glasnost, literally meaning openness, he initially hoped people would speak up and help identify problems within the Soviet system. But once ordinary citizens got their first real taste of free speech, there was no turning back. At this point, even Soviet-era media started reporting on topics that had once been completely off limits, like Stalin's brutal purges, the catastrophic Soviet war in Afghanistan, massive environmental destruction, widespread corruption among high-ranking officials, and above all, the shocking depth of the ongoing economic crisis. Newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia began printing letters from citizens who described empty stores, polluted rivers near factories, or local corruption that had long been swept under the rug. These uncomfortable truths had always been hidden to maintain the illusion of socialism's superiority, but now they were laid bare for everyone to see. Now, pay attention to this next part, because, like I said earlier, Gorbachev did have good intentions. So this time, due to the newfound openness among the public, he decided to hold the first relatively free elections since the 1920s. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens had real choices, including independent candidates and non-communists in many districts. Even though the Communist Party still secured most seats, the change in voter base was dramatic. In Moscow, voters elected the legendary dissident scientist Andrei Sakharov, who was previously banned from public life. Similarly, Boris Yeltsin, a former communist official who had openly criticized the party and walked away from it, reinvented himself as a popular pro-reform politician and won a landslide victory in Moscow. Gorbachev had hoped glasnost would keep the Soviet Union together, but instead it sparked nationalist movements. Starting around 1988, republics from the Caucasus to the Baltics demanded autonomy or complete independence from Moscow. These movements weren't just about politics. A lot of it came from economic anger. Many non-Russian republics felt like Moscow was using their resources but giving little back. Their industries were ignored, their people were poorer, and their regions stayed underdeveloped. With central control rapidly weakening, republics started passing their own laws, claiming control over local resources and finances. By 1990, the entire Soviet structure was crumbling. Everywhere you looked, economic, political, social, the Soviet Union was splitting apart at the seams. And then, as if things weren't already bad enough, came the real financial crisis of early 1991. Years of reckless money printing meant there were now far more rubles in circulation than goods to buy, a perfect recipe for hyperinflation. Gorbachev's government knew that simply lifting price controls would cause prices to explode. So in a desperate move, Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov introduced an emergency currency reform. In January of 1991, almost overnight, Pavlov declared all 50 and 100 ruble notes worthless, giving citizens just 3 days to exchange their old banknotes. But each person can only exchange up to 1,000 rubles, which officially amounted to roughly $1,700 to $1,800 at official exchange rates. But street value quickly dropped to just about $40 to $50. The idea was to wipe out illegal cash holdings and crush the thriving black market, and reduce inflation. But instead, the reform triggered widespread panic and chaos. Millions of citizens, especially those in big cities, had saved large sums of cash for years, tucked away for emergencies or major purchases like a car or an apartment. Suddenly, their savings were rendered nearly worthless overnight. Banks imposed tight withdrawal limits and required proof of income to exchange larger sums. People queued desperately for hours, hoping to salvage whatever they could of their life savings. The reform felt to many like a hostile government attack on its own people, an assault on their trust and the very little financial security they had. Even worse, the reform completely failed to kill the black market. The larger operators knew it was coming, or they had the right connections to get around it. According to official figures, only about 14 billion rubles out of the targeted 30 billion were actually pulled out of circulation. The currency reform ended up undermining what little faith was left in the Soviet leaders' competence. And now the government was not only running out of options, but also running out of time. Politically, Gorbachev was stuck in the middle. One side were hardline communists who thought he'd gone too far. On the other were reformers who thought he hadn't done enough. In the Russian Republic, the biggest part of the USSR, Boris Yeltsin had become president, and now even Yeltsin was pushing for Russian sovereignty. Basically, he wanted Russia to control its own decisions, instead of taking orders from the Soviet government. That was a big problem, because Russia was the heart of the USSR. So when Yeltsin acted like a nationalist leader, it directly challenged Gorbachev's power. Seeing this, other republics like Ukraine began preparing for their own independence referendums. Gorbachev tried to hold things together. He negotiated a new union treaty that would turn the USSR into a more relaxed federation, hoping that would be enough to stop the breakup. But the hardliners, people in the government, the KGB, the military, saw this as the final straw. They blamed Gorbachev for all the chaos. On August 19th, 1991, while Gorbachev was on vacation in Crimea, they launched a coup. They declared a state of emergency, rolled tanks into Moscow, and claimed Gorbachev was sick and they were taking control to restore order. This August coup was the old system's last desperate attempt to survive, but it failed in just 3 days. And a big reason it collapsed was Boris Yeltsin. Crowds in Moscow came out to support him and defend the Russian White House, the building where Yeltsin and his government were based. The coup plotters lost nerve and failed to arrest key figures or fully cut off communications. In the end, the military units refused to fire on the people, and the coup leaders were arrested. Gorbachev came back to Moscow, but it was all over for him. He'd been sidelined during the coup and now looked even weaker. The Communist Party was discredited. People saw them as power-hungry men willing to risk civil war to stay in control. The failed coup was the final blow to the Soviet Union. In its aftermath, the momentum was with Yeltsin and the Republican leaders who wanted independence. One by one, republics declared independence from the Union. The Baltics actually did so even during the coup. Gorbachev found himself president of a country that was dissolving in front of his eyes. Then came the final step. On December 8th, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in secret, agreed to dissolve the USSR, and replace it with a loose commonwealth of independent states. They didn't even tell Gorbachev. Faced with no other option, Gorbachev resigned on December 25th, 1991. That night, the red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin. And by January 1st, 1992, the USSR was gone. It was a massive end to 74 years of a socialist state. But what came after was even tougher for the former Soviet republics, especially Russia. The early 1990s were brutal. As the old planned economy disappeared, the country tried to shift to capitalism almost overnight. And it did not go well. In 1992 alone, Russia saw hyperinflation of over 2,500%. People's entire savings vanished. It wiped out whole generations of wealth. Shops finally had goods, but no one could afford them. So what did 70 years of Soviet communism and 1 year of capitalism have in common? Both left you broke. But at least under communism, there was nothing to buy, so it didn't sting as bad. Now, Gorbachev meant well. His reforms were not some crazy gamble. If you had been in his shoes, you probably would have done the same. Try to fix the system, open it up, right? Give people freedoms. But that's the thing, these systems aren't simple. What looks like a good idea in theory can turn into a disaster in reality. His reforms didn't fix the USSR. They sped up its collapse. But was that collapse inevitable? Well, not everyone agrees. That's where we bring in China. At the same time Gorbachev was reforming the USSR, Deng Xiaoping was reforming China. But China didn't collapse. It grew. So what made the difference? One big factor was the order of reforms. Deng Xiaoping, the man leading China, did the opposite of Gorbachev. He kept the Communist Party in full control, crushed any political dissent, and only changed the economy. No glasnost, no open criticism of the Communist Party. That was still off limits. When people did protest, like in Tiananmen Square in 1989, the Chinese government didn't hesitate to crush it with brutal force. Deng believed Gorbachev was making a huge mistake, weakening the party's grip before fixing the economy. From China's view, that's what destroyed the Soviet Union. Too much freedom, too soon, with no safety net underneath. Even in 2022, Chinese officials still bring up Gorbachev as a lesson. What not to do if you want to survive as a one-party state. Another big difference was how they reformed. China went slow. They started in the countryside with agriculture. That was the easiest place to see quick results. Let peasants farm for profit, and boom, food production went up. Rural incomes rose. People started to believe in the reform. Over time, they opened up factories, created special economic zones, allowed foreign money to come in, and kept a close eye on the whole process. The USSR had no easy starting point like that. It was an urban industrial economy. You couldn't just privatize a huge steel plant and expect things to go smoothly. And for years, Soviet reforms were half-baked. From 1987 to 1990, it was a mix of old and new that didn't work well together. And then, when they finally tried something bold like freeing prices, it was a shock to the system. Too much, too fast, and it broke. And finally, the structure of the country mattered more than anyone admitted. The Soviet Union wasn't one nation. It was a patchwork of republics, each with its own history, its own language, its own identity. Once the central power weakened, all these republics started breaking off. Nationalism exploded. People wanted their own countries. There was nothing Gorbachev could offer that would make them stay. China didn't have that problem. Yes, it's multi-ethnic too, but the Han Chinese are the majority, and the state is more centralized. Places like Tibet or Xinjiang have always been resistive, but China handled them with a tight grip. Military control, constant surveillance, and no talk of secession. The USSR didn't do that. It had 15 republics with the constitutional right to leave. And when they saw the cracks, they took that chance. So when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, people in Russia thought maybe things would start getting better. They had a new president, Boris Yeltsin, and for a short while there was hope. But instead of going slow, even Yeltsin jumped headfirst into what was called shock therapy. Western economists said it would work. The idea was to switch from a planned economy to a market one almost overnight, and that meant ending price controls. And just like that, prices shot up by over 2,500%. If something cost 1 ruble last year, it now costs more than 25. People's savings, money they'd worked their whole lives for, were wiped out in weeks. Families that thought they were stable suddenly found themselves broke. The rubles people had hidden under mattresses or saved in state banks for decades were now worth next to nothing. You could barely buy a few loaves of bread with them. The government tried to fix it later, but it was too late and the damage was already done. One study showed poverty jumped just 2% from the late 1980s to around 50% by the mid-1990s. Half the country now lived below the poverty line. That's why Russians call this time the Wild 90s. Prices changed so fast that by the time you got your paycheck, it wasn't enough to buy anything. In 1994, millions of workers hadn't been paid in months. Even coal and oil workers had to strike, and even hunger strike. Not for changes or reforms, but just to get what they were owed. Then came one of the biggest scandals of all time, the Loans for Shares program. Yeltsin's government, desperate for cash and political support, let a handful of insiders lend cash to the state. In return, those insiders were rewarded with ownership of Russia's crown jewels company when the state defaulted, which, like the state planned, it would. By the end of the decade, the oligarchs had their own banks, their own oil empires, TV stations, and even their own seats in government. While the general public was fighting for food just to survive, a tiny few were getting obscenely rich, and thus began a new class of oligarchs, well-connected businessmen who snapped up oil companies, metal plants, and banks for pennies on the ruble. The gap between rich and poor became massive. Crime exploded. The streets weren't safe. Mafia shootouts and contract killings were happening so often, they became part of the evening news. And one of the clearest signs of how bad things had gotten was life expectancy. Russian men were dying young from alcohol, stress, violence, and hopelessness. By the mid-1990s, male life expectancy had dropped to just about 57 years old, the lowest in the developed world. For context, a Russian man in 1994 could expect to live 7 years less than he would have just 4 years earlier. So it's no surprise that Yeltsin's popularity didn't last long. But what came next shook the country even more. The old Soviet politicians and parliament were still powerful. They hated Yeltsin's reforms and refused to go along with them. So Yeltsin tried to dissolve the parliament, but they fought back. They even tried to impeach him, but Yeltsin responded by calling in the army. What happened next was something that Russia hadn't seen since 1917. Tanks rolled into Moscow, not to defend the city, but to fire on its own parliament. On live TV, the army shelled the White House. Fires broke out. Gun battles erupted on the streets. Official numbers say nearly 200 people died, but many believe it was much more than that. It was the worst street fighting Moscow had seen in decades. In the end, Yeltsin won. The parliament was crushed. The remaining lawmakers were arrested or went underground. And with that, Russia's experiment with democracy came to a stop. Yeltsin then pushed through a new constitution in December of 1993, one that handed a huge amount of power to the presidency. This super presidential system, approved through a rushed referendum right after the bloodshed, gave Yeltsin and any future president sweeping control over the government, security services, and the power to rule by decree. At the time, most Russians accepted it. They were tired and they wanted stability. But they didn't realize this same constitution would later help Putin build the autocracy we still see today. With parliament out of the way, Yeltsin pushed more reforms. But instead of cleaning up the system, corruption just got worse. By the mid-90s, the idea of rule of law barely meant anything. Oligarchs, crime bosses, and regional power brokers divided up the country like turf. If you were a journalist and you dug too deep, you risked being killed. One reporter, Dmitry Kholodov, was blown up by a briefcase bomb in 1994 while investigating corruption in the army. No one was ever punished for it. Then came war. In 1994, Chechnya, a small Muslim-majority region in the south, declared independence. Yeltsin, afraid other regions might follow, sent in the army. He expected a quick win, but the Russian military, poorly trained, underfunded, and led by outdated Soviet officers, wasn't ready. They walked into a brutal urban war in the Chechen capital, Grozny. Russian tanks burned. Young conscripts died by the thousands. Coffins came home in zinc boxes. Civilian casualties were massive. Russian forces bombed entire neighborhoods, and both sides were accused of serious war crimes. After 2 years of bloodshed, Russia backed off. Chechnya got de facto independence. Yeltsin got nothing, except thousands of dead and another blow to national pride. Not long ago, Russia had been a superpower. Now it couldn't even defeat a small breakaway region. The same pride and miscalculation are playing out today in Ukraine. By the way, on paper, Russia still had elections and a free press. So when the 1996 presidential election came around, things looked legitimate. But Yeltsin's approval was in the single digits. Most people saw him as sick, drunk, and blamed him for the country falling apart. Yet somehow he still won. Oligarch-owned TV channels ran constant attacks on his communist opponent, shaping public opinion with nonstop fear campaigns. And there were strong signs of vote rigging as well. The oligarchs saved Yeltsin, and in return, they got even more power. By the late 90s, all of this left Russian society hollowed out. People had lost faith. Alcoholism and suicide rates were through the roof. Families stopped having kids. They simply couldn't afford it anymore. And for the first time in Russia's modern history, more people were dying than being born. Then came the final blow, the 1998 financial meltdown. After years of corruption, shaky banks, and growing government debt, everything collapsed in August. Oil prices, Russia's main income, crashed. Investors pulled out. The government defaulted on its debt and devalued the ruble. In just days, the currency lost over 60% of its value. Savings vanished. Inflation hit 84%. Wages dropped by 30%. Pensions fell nearly 45%. And when banks shut their doors, millions of people lost everything. It was the second major collapse in less than a decade. And with it, any trust in Russia's leadership collapsed as well. By 1999, Russia's GDP had dropped to 60% of what it was in 1991. Poverty was everywhere. Yeltsin's government was barely holding on, changing prime ministers every few months. And Yeltsin himself was no longer the bold figure who had stood on the tank in 1991. Years of drinking and heart problems left him weak and often confused. He even missed a meeting with Ireland's prime minister in 1994 by oversleeping. And in Sweden in 1997, he drunkenly tried conducting a military band. People stopped seeing him as a leader. And on top of all that, corruption had crept right into his inner circle. Nicknamed the Family, whispers of bribery, shady contracts, and favors reached even his closest relatives. One scandal involved a Swiss firm, Mobitex, which was accused of bribing Kremlin officials in return for renovation contracts. Some of that money allegedly tracing back to Yeltsin's own daughter. With his health failing and his popularity gone, Yeltsin made a choice. He needed someone who could take over, protect him from prosecution, and somehow bring back control. On New Year's Eve, 1999, he shocked everyone by resigning and handing power to Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who'd only just become prime minister. At 47, Putin was still unknown to most Russians. But that changed really fast. One of his first acts as leader was to sign a decree giving Yeltsin immunity from any corruption charges. From there, Putin started shaping his own Russia. One with stronger central control, less democracy, and an economy powered by oil. He even promised to destroy the Chechen rebels completely, even from the outhouse. It was rough language, but many Russians liked it, because most of them hated Chechens after the First War. In Moscow and other cities, Chechens were regularly harassed, stereotyped, and seen as outsiders. But Putin needed a reason to invade. And guess what? In September of 1999, random apartments started blowing up across Russian cities. Over 300 people died. The country was terrified. The Kremlin blamed Chechen terrorists almost immediately. No trial, no real investigation. It was the final spark. Russians were already angry and scared, and now they wanted revenge. Putin used this anger to launch the Second Chechen War. This time, Russia bombed Grozny to the ground, crushed organized resistance, and reasserted control over Chechnya. It was brutal, but it worked. By early 2000, the war had made Putin wildly popular. State media hailed him as the man who brought back order and pride. And in March of 2000, he easily won the presidency. But when people looked closer, those 1999 bombings started to look suspicious. In the city of Ryazan, locals caught what looked like another bombing in progress. On September 22, 1999, sacks of explosives were found in an apartment building. Police were called. A timer and detonators were in place. The FSB was caught in the act. But instead of an investigation, the FSB later claimed it was just a training exercise, and that the sacks were filled with sugar. No one believed that. I mean, Why would a secret drill involve a real bomb in a real building without telling anyone? Even the government sealed the evidence and blocked any real investigation. That only made things look worse. A banned documentary called Assassination of Russia, made by exiles, claimed the FSB did it to help Putin justify the war and boost his image. To this day, many Russians still believe the bombings were staged. A false flag. We may never know the full truth, but suffice it to say, Putin's ascent was built on a foundation of war and bloodthirst. To be fair, things did get more stable once Putin took charge, and part of that had nothing to do with him. Around the time he took office, global oil prices started climbing. Russia, being an oil and gas-heavy economy, rode that wave pretty hard. Between 2000 and 2008, the GDP grew nearly 7% each year. People's incomes went up. A proper middle class started forming. For the first time, many Russians bought cars. They traveled abroad, and they filled their homes with appliances. Poverty dropped from about 30% to just 14% in less than a decade. It felt like Russia was finally pulling itself out of the mess of the 90s. And while luck and oil did most of the work, Putin took the credit. Once people were more or less satisfied, and his image as a strong nationalist leader was locked in, Putin moved to phase 2. He started using the full power Yeltsin had written into the presidency. Remember, Yeltsin had designed the system to concentrate control in the hands of one man. Now Putin was that one man, and he wasn't going to waste the opportunity. He went after the oligarchs, not because they were corrupt, but because they were independent. Guys like Berezovsky and Kuczynski had too much influence. It wasn't about fairness, he just wanted control. He clipped the wings of the oligarchs who had meddled in politics and replaced them with a new system, where loyalty mattered more than anything else. That's what he meant by the power vertical. All decisions came from the top. Wealth, influence, media, nothing moved without the Kremlin's nod. If you played along, you could still make billions. But if you stepped out of line, the state came for you. One of the first to learn that lesson was Vladimir Kuczynski. He owned NTV, the biggest independent TV station in Russia, and one of the few bold enough to question the government. They had criticized the war in Chechnya and even looked into the FSB's possible role in the 1999 apartment bombings. Now, that didn't sit well with Putin. In mid-2000, Kuczynski was arrested on fraud charges. Soon after, he fled the country. Then Gazprom, a state energy company with deep Kremlin ties, took over NTV. In April of 2001, armed officers stormed NTV's offices at 3 a.m., kicked out the management, and replaced them. Dozens of journalists quit in protest, but the channel was already lost. 2 more independent channels, TV6 and TVS, were shut down or taken over soon after. By the end of Putin's first year in office, press freedom was basically dead. The big networks either became government mouthpieces or stuck to light entertainment. The media had been one of the last checks on state power, and now it was gone. From that point on, Putin could do almost anything, and barely anyone in Russia could call him out. Then, in 2003, Putin made an example out of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was the richest man in Russia, ran the Yukos oil company, and had started funding opposition parties and speaking against Kremlin policies. That was a line you couldn't cross. He was arrested at gunpoint, charged with fraud and tax evasion, and sentenced to 10 years in a Siberian prison. Yukos was broken apart and handed over to Rosneft, a state-owned company. Most of the other oligarchs got the message. Some ran. Boris Berezovsky, who once helped bring Putin to power, fled to London. He later turned into a vocal critic and was found dead under suspicious circumstances. At the same time, Putin built a new elite, billionaires who were either his old friends from St. Petersburg or ex-KGB colleagues. They were handed control over huge sectors of the economy. Loyalty became more valuable than competence. Lastly, Putin also changed election laws, clamped down on opposition parties, and cut down the power of regional leaders. In 2004, after a terrorist attack in Beslan, Putin seized the moment to abolish direct elections for regional governors. Thereafter, governors were appointed by the president. This removed a whole layer of accountability and concentrated power further in Moscow. And anyone who still dared to speak out, well, they didn't last. For example, Boris Nemtsov, a former deputy prime minister turned critic, was shot dead near the Kremlin in 2015. Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist who exposed war crimes in Chechnya, was killed in her apartment building's elevator in 2006. On Putin's birthday, no less. The hitmen sometimes got caught, but never the ones who ordered the hits. The pattern kept repeating, year after year. Those who spoke out too loudly against Putin's policies risked their careers at best and their lives at worst. For most ordinary Russians, Putin's tight grip on power felt like a fair trade, stability, and national pride in exchange for political freedoms. But that sense of prosperity was built on shaky ground. Russia's economy leaned almost entirely on oil, gas, and raw materials. Meanwhile, corruption, mismanagement, and a refusal to reform quietly ate away the country's future. Instead of diversifying or building a modern economy, Putin doubled down on state control. Russia never moved beyond being a glorified gas station with nukes. And and that failure would come back to bite them hard. When the 2008 financial crisis hit and oil prices dropped, the cracks became obvious. From 2009 to 2019, Russia's average annual growth was just 1%, even slower than the stagnation days under Brezhnev. Real wages went flat. By 2019, the average Russian was making the same as they did back in 2013. That's 6 years of zero progress. People started making the same old Soviet-era jokes again. They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. The dream they were sold in the early 2000s had clearly gone stale. And based on the statistics provided in the intro of this video, you already know that Putin didn't do shit for Russia. So what went wrong with his presidential terms? Well, by killing off independent media, elections, and courts, Putin also killed off all the warning signs that could have helped fix the economy. When anyone spoke out, journalists, professors, or activists, they were silenced, jailed, or forced out. Over 500,000 people left the country between 2022 and 2023, a brain drain powered by fear, war, and no future. Patriotism didn't pay the bills. More and more people saw no future for themselves in Russia. And you know by now, war is Putin's favorite trick to stay in power. So in 2014, when his popularity was dipping and people were unsure of him, he invaded and annexed Crimea from Ukraine. People at home cheered. His approval rating shot above 80%, but it came at a steep cost. Sanctions, isolation, and a shrinking economy. Still, he stayed in power while the ordinary Russians paid the price. He tried to do the same in 2022, hoping a quick victory would seal his name to be one of the greatest Russian leaders ever. But instead of glory, he triggered Europe's deadliest war since World War II. If you think ordinary Russians benefited from this rally around the flag effect, think again. So far, total casualties have easily crossed 1 million men, not to mention the thousands of families uprooted and some that starved to death. The only legacy he's really leaving is one of grief. And the saddest part is that Russia didn't have to end up like this. It had everything it needed to succeed after the Soviet collapse. Natural resources, educated people, a chance to join the global economy, but every leader fumbled it in their own way. Gorbachev's reforms spiraled out of control. Yeltsin's democratic experiment was poisoned by corruption and incompetence. And Putin, for all his early stability, chose the path of autocracy, stagnation, and conflict over genuine modernization. In 1992, Russians were told to suffer shock therapy for a brighter future that never arrived. In 2000, they were told to trade freedoms for order and pride, only to end up with new stagnation and a militarized pariah state. The faces at the top changed, but the regular Russian suffered as always. Life stayed hard, and here we are in 2025, and it's still Putin. He's in his 70s now, clinging to power with constitutional manipulations that could see him rule until 2036. Looking back, one can't help but ask, was this trajectory inevitable? Some will argue yes, blaming historical inertia or foreign hostility, but many Russians, especially those who have seen the outside world, know it didn't have to be this way. There were alternate paths, different policies, more accountability, less imperial ambition. Countries like Poland or the Baltics transformed and vastly improved their standards of living by embracing democracy and reform, despite their own hardships in the 90s. Even China, while authoritarian, at least delivered growth. Russia, tragically, ended up with the worst of both worlds: the economic malaise of a mismanaged capitalism and the political repression of a dictatorship. So when economists, journalists, and academics like Abel Aganbegin speak up, despite the risk, you've got to respect their courage. In a place where truth can cost you everything, their voices stand out. They prove that not all Russians are lost to propaganda. Some still care enough to warn the country before it sinks further. In the end, whether Russia's economy remains dead or can be revived will depend on political change as much as economic policy. Without accountability and openness, no real reform is possible. And without ending the war, Russia can't reconnect with the global economy or focus on development rather than destruction. History's full of surprises, and Russia might once again find itself humbled, this time by Ukraine, similar to the First Chechen War. Thanks for watching.